In August 1944, General George S. Patton's army was moving so fast that many believed nothing in Europe could stop it. Then, without warning, thousands of his soldiers ran out of food, not because they were surrounded, not because the Germans had defeated them, but because the most powerful army in the world had outrun its own supply lines. For 3 days, tank crews sat hungry beside vehicles that were almost out of fuel. The advance that had shattered German defenses across France was on the verge of collapsing without a major battle being fought. What happened next was so unusual that it forced Patton to abandon the normal rules of military logistics, and according to the men who were there, one decision during those desperate days, may have saved the entire advance. This is the story of what Patton did when his men went 3 days without food. On August 28, 1944, elements of the 3rd Army's 12th Corps stood approximately 60 miles east of the Seine River. The 4th Armored Division, one of Patton's most trusted formations, had its lead elements near the town of Commerce on the Meuse River in the Lorraine region of northeastern France. If this is the kind of history that matters to you, stories where the record actually holds up, where the details come from documents and memoirs and unit logs rather than myth, then subscribe to this channel and leave a like before we go further. Costs you nothing and it tells us this work is worth continuing. Temperatures that week had climbed into the low 8 south. The roads were choked with the residue of rapid advance, burned out German vehicles, blown culverts, and columns of prisoners moving west against the grain of supply trucks that were no longer coming forward. The men of the division had not received a regular ration delivery in 72 hours. Some units had been subsisting on what they carried on their persons, supplemented by whatever the French countryside offered. The tanks were nearly dry. This was not a battlefield crisis in the conventional sense. No German counterattack was imminent at that precise moment. The crisis was logistical and it was systemic, and it threatened to end the most successful armored campaign the Western Allies had mounted in the entire war. To understand what Patton did next, it is necessary to understand the precise mechanism by which his army had run dry. The Allied supply system in the summer of 1944 had been designed around a set of assumptions at the speed of operation after the Normandy breakout had rendered obsolete almost overnight. The original Overlord planners had estimated that Allied forces would reach the Seine River by D+90, that is 90 days after the June 6 landings. Patton's army reached the Seine in approximately D+75. They then crossed it and kept going. By the time 12 Corps reached the Meuse, the front line was more than 400 miles from the primary supply depots still operating out of the Normandy beach areas and the port of Cherbourg. The infrastructure to bridge that distance simply did not exist. The Red Ball Express, the famous convoy system of predominantly black American soldiers driving 10-ton trucks around the clock along specially designated one-way highway loops, was moving an average of 12,000 tons of supplies per day. By late August, it was not enough. The trucks themselves consumed enormous quantities of fuel simply to make the round trip. A loaded truck running from the Normandy depots to the forward areas near the Meuse burned most of what it carried just in the act of delivering. The arithmetic was brutal. Patton understood this arithmetic precisely. He had been watching his fuel allocations for 2 weeks, calculating, arguing, and planning around a shortage he saw coming before most of his superiors acknowledged it. His diary entries from this period are bitter and frustrated in equal measure. He wrote on August 21st that the army could go another 200 meters if it had the fuel. He wrote 2 days later that it might not be able to move at all within the week. On August 28th, the fuel allocation to the 3rd Army was formally cut. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force SHAEF had made a command decision. Priority for fuel and supplies was being shifted to Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group in the north, supporting a proposed thrust into the Low Countries and ultimately toward the Ruhr. This decision, sometimes called the single thrust debate, would be argued over by historians and generals for decades afterward. For the men of 12 Corps on the Meuse, That morning, its immediate consequence was simple and severe. The fuel trucks stopped coming, and with the fuel trucks came the ration trucks, and those had stopped as well. Staff Sergeant Walter Spren of the 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division, later described the situation in a post-war interview collected by the United States Army's historical program. He said that by the morning of the 28th, his crew had eaten their last rations the previous afternoon. They had a partial box of hard crackers and 2 cans of meat that one of the men had taken off a dead German soldier 2 days prior. The tank had perhaps 30 gall of gasoline remaining in its main tanks. 30 gallons in an M for Sherman would carry the vehicle roughly 60 miles under normal road conditions. In combat, significantly less. The engine was also running rough, a filter problem that the mechanics had not had time to address. During the continuous movement, Spren said his crew was not panicking. They had been through hard weeks before, but there was a quality to the quiet that morning, he said, that was different from the ordinary quiet of a unit at rest. It was the quiet of men who did not know when they would eat again and were not certain whether their vehicle would start reliably when they needed it to. Across the division, the situation was replicated at every level. Infantrymen attached to armored columns had walked so far and so fast that their boots were coming apart. Maintenance crews had been working without sleep for days, cannibalizing parts from destroyed vehicles to keep the operational ones running. The medical system was strained. Evacuation routes back through France were long, and the hospitals at the rear were absorbing casualties from the weeks of fighting at a rate that kept every available urgent busy. Patton received the formal notification of the supply cutback at his forward command post, to which at that time was operating from a requisitioned French farmhouse near Chasant-Lancer. His reaction, according to his chief of staff, General Hobart Gay, was controlled but immediate. He did not rage at the message or at the officer who delivered it. He read it twice, set it down, and began making phone calls. The first call was to his G4, the officer responsible for supply and logistics, Brigadier General Walter Mueller. Patton told Mueller to find out exactly how much fuel existed within the Third Army's area of operations at that precise moment. Not what was scheduled to arrive, not what was theoretically in the pipeline, but what was physically present and accessible. He wanted numbers by nightfall. Mueller's report delivered that evening presented a picture that was dire, but not yet terminal. The Third Army had, when all sources were counted, sufficient fuel to sustain limited operations for approximately 72 hours. That included fuel stored at divisional trains, fuel in the tanks of vehicles currently operational, and fuel that could be salvaged from damaged or destroyed German vehicles, and fuel points captured during the advance. The food situation was similar. There were rations in the rear, but moving them forward without fuel for the trucks was a compounding problem. Moving rations required trucks. Moving trucks required fuel. The fuel was what was missing. Patton made 2 decisions that night, both of which were outside the normal chain of supply authorization. The first was to authorize the diversion of fuel originally allocated to non-combat elements of his own Army administrative units, rear area headquarters, and transport formations, not immediately essential to frontline operations. Patton directed that these units would receive reduced allocations or none at all, and that the fuel recovered would be redistributed to the armored and infantry units at the front. This was not a popular decision among the staff officers who ran those administrative units, but it was within Patton's authority as Army commander, and it was done without hesitation. The second decision was more unconventional, and it is the one for which this particular episode is most frequently remembered by historians who have examined the Third Army's logistics. In the fall of 1944, Patton directed his aviation liaison officer to coordinate a series of air transport missions using whatever cargo-capable aircraft could be diverted from the 9th Troop Carrier Command and the 9 Air Force support elements operating in France. The purpose was to fly gasoline and rations directly to forward airstrips near 12 Corps positions on the Meuse this was not standard procedure. The available C-47 aircraft in the theater had primary commitments to airborne operations, casualty, evacuation, and priority resupply for other commands. But Patton had relationships with air commanders, and he had a persuasive case to make. If 12 Corps could not move within 48 hours, the momentum of the entire Allied advance in the center would be lost. Whatever German formations were attempting to reconstitute east of the Meuse would have time to organize defensive positions. The window of exploitation, the brief and irreplaceable period in which a broken enemy cannot yet form coherent resistance, would close. The air transport missions were small by the standards of later operations. Over 2 days between August 29th and August 30th, an estimated 40 to 50 C-47 sorties delivered fuel and rations to forward landing strips that engineers had hastily improved from farm fields near Urs and Toll. Each aircraft carried approximately 6,000 pounds of cargo, a mixture of 5-gallon fuel jerkins and packaged sections. The total tonnage delivered was not large. It was in the precise meaning of the phrase enough. At the same time, Patton was working through other channels. He contacted the commanders of his corps directly, General Manton Eddy of 12 Corps and General Walton Walker of the 20th Corps, and told them to forage. That word in its military sense meant what it had always meant: find what you need from the land and from the enemy. French civilians, grateful and cooperative, directed American soldiers to barns and cellars where German supply stocks had been hidden or abandoned. Several fuel points established by the retreating Wehrmacht were captured intact or nearly so. One company from the 4th Armored Support Battalion located a German supply depot outside the village of St. Mahel containing several thousand L of diesel fuel. A poor substitute for gasoline in the Sherman's carburetor system, but workable. In the wheeled vehicles of the division's logistics train, which freed up gasoline for the tanks, the men who were hungry ate not well and not enough by any standard measure, but the rations that came forward by air and by truck and by the effort of hundreds of soldiers working through the night of August 29th were distributed across the forward units of 12 Corps. By the morning of August 30th, Staff Sergeant Sprentz, in the same post-war interview mentioned earlier, said that the first real food he received after the 3-day gap was a case of sea rations. The can variety, with the small accessory packet containing matches, cigarettes, and instant coffee. He said he ate the entire contents of a can of beef hash while sitting on the rear deck of his Sherman in a field outside Commercy. He remembered the field specifically. It was bordered by a stone wall on one side and an apple orchard on the other, and there were cattle in the far corner that had apparently been undisturbed by the war for some time. He ate the hash cold because he did not want to wait for it to warm. It would be a mistake to frame this episode as a triumph of Patton's personality against an impersonal system. The reality was more complicated. The fuel and supply crisis of late August 1944 was not fully resolved by the measures Patton improvised. The Third Army's advance did pause. The air transport missions provided a margin, but not a solution. The fundamental problem that Allied logistics could not sustain simultaneous maximum effort advances by multiple army groups across a 400-mile front remained unsolved and would contribute directly to the stalling of the Allied advance in September and to the subsequent difficulties of the autumn campaign, including the disaster at Arnhem and the grinding attrition of the Lorraine campaign in which 12 Corps would spend the next 3 months. Patton himself understood this. His diary entries from September and October 1944 return repeatedly to the theme of supply with an urgency that never entirely left him for the remainder of the campaign. He argued consistently and sometimes bitterly that had his army been given priority for fuel in late August, it could have crossed the Rhine before the German defensive lines cohered. Whether that argument is correct remains a subject of serious historical debate. What is not debated is the character of the effort he made when the supply chain failed the immediate inventory, the reallocation, the air transport, the authorized foraging, the direct communication with corps commanders, and the specific consequence that his soldiers did not go a fourth day without food. There is a detail in the record of those days that does not appear in most accounts of the Third Army's advance, but which was noted by Colonel Robert S. Allen, who served on Patton's staff and later wrote a contemporary history of the Third Army's operations. Allen recorded that on the evening of August 29, as the air transport arrangements were being finalized and the foraging parties were beginning to return with salvaged German stocks, Patton visited the forward command post of the 4th Armored Division in person. He did not come to deliver a speech or to be seen by the troops in any formal sense. He came, according to Allen, to look at the fuel and ration situation with his own eyes, to speak directly with the division's logistics officer and to ensure that what he had ordered was actually being executed. He stayed for approximately 40 minutes. He examined the fuel inventory sheets himself. He asked the logistics officer specific questions about distribution priorities and about which units were farthest short of what they needed. He made several on-the-spot adjustments to the distribution plan, directing that the lead tank battalion receive priority over the reserve battalion and that the artillery ammunition train, which had more fuel than originally reported, release a portion of its reserve to the infantry transport. Then he left. No soldiers watched him arrive or depart in any ceremony. Most of the men of the 4th Armored did not know he had been there. What they knew beginning on the morning of August 30th was that food had come forward and that the tanks had enough fuel to move. They moved on September 1st. The 12th Corps crossed the Meuse River and entered Lorraine. The campaign that followed was harder and slower than anything the Third Army had experienced in the dash across France. A year the terrain was different. The weather was turning and the Germans had used the days of the Allied supply pause to establish new defensive lines along the Moselle and later the Saar, but the army moved. The pause had not become a collapse. The supply crisis of late August 1944 left a set of lessons that the United States Army absorbed slowly and incompletely in the months that followed. The Red Ball Express was expanded and improved. Air transport of forward supplies, improvised by necessity in Patton's situation, became a more formal element of planning for subsequent operations. The debate over logistics priority between Montgomery's northern thrust and the American advance through the center was never fully resolved to anyone's satisfaction, and contributed to a series of command disagreements that marked the final year of the war in Europe for the individual soldiers who lived through those 3 days. The men who ate crackers from their pockets and waited in fields that smelled of French summer and diesel exhaust, the specific unmistakable odor of military equipment at the edge of its operational limit. The memory was of a particular kind of uncertainty, not the uncertainty of combat, which was its own category of experience, but the uncertainty of an institution failing to sustain them, followed by the correcting action of someone in authority who did not accept that failure as permanent. Staff Sergeant Spren was asked in his post-war interview whether those 3 days had affected his confidence in the Army or in the command above him. He said they had not. He said that when the food came forward on August 30th, it came because someone had done something to make it come. He said he did not know at the time who that someone was. He found out later. He said that made a difference to how he thought about the whole thing. George S. Patton died on December 21, 1945, 12 days after a road accident in Mannheim, Germany. He was 60 years old. He was buried with his men at the American Military Cemetery at Ham, Luxembourg, among the soldiers of the Third Army who had died in the campaign he commanded. He had specifically requested to be buried among the men who had served under him, rather than return to the United States. The 4th Armored Division was deactivated in March 1946. Its colors were eventually reactivated and the division's lineage continues in the United States Army today. The men who drove its tanks and walked beside them from Normandy to the German border are almost all gone now. Their accounts, where they survive, are preserved in the collections of the United States Army Military History Institute at Carl, Pennsylvania, and in the archives of the Patton Museum and the Tank Destroyer Association. They were hungry for 3 days in August 1944. Then they were not. Then they crossed the Moselle and fought through the autumn and the winter and eventually into Germany itself. That is the record they left. It is worth remembering.